I think Paul's legacy is one that he shares very much with Erica in the story of who Paul was and how he made his art, why he made his art, and how Erica supported him during his lifetime. And when, after Paul's death, she continued to cherish his art, to promote his art. So the legacy, I think, is really one of the perseverance of art in its importance in one person's life and in the life of that person's spouse. And I would say on a community. And that's a very rare and unusual thing.
So Erica's legacy is amazing. It is not only her anthropological work and her research in voodoo, altered states, women's studies, religion. She was an exceptional scholar. She was an early pioneer in the field of anthropology. She wrote hundreds of books, articles, reviews, but I think her true legacy would be the students she inspired and she taught to think.
When I think of Paul and Erica, I really feel like they are a groundbreaking couple. At the time that their careers were expanding, they really upended the typical stereotypes and gender roles that were in place in mid-century America.
Paul-Henri Bourguignon was born in Brussels, Belgium in 1906. His father was a French-speaking Belgian and his mother was a Dutch-speaking Belgian. So in his background, he had the two different sides of cultural heritage of Brussels and of Belgium. He had a very early show at a commercial gallery in Brussels when he was about 22. And according to Erica, it sold out, or it almost entirely sold out. So he had success as a young man.
World War I ended in 1918, but the conflict left Belgium in a mess. You know, there were serious physical, psychological, cultural damage to the whole city. And because of that, I think as a young man in the interwar years, Paul began to travel wildly. So he went outside of Belgium. He went first to Paris and then Spain. He went on to discover North Africa, explored Yugoslavia, Italy, Corsica. He recorded what he saw in photographs, and he took his little box of pastels around and he started to paint the countryside with pastels.
He doesn't go back to university until about 1934. And then he is studying at the Free University of Brussels when he goes into a graduate program in art history. And that's when he developed his research on the Spanish painter El Greco.
And then World War II intervened and completely, overturned his life as it did that of millions of other people.
And Belgium had actually been trying to remain neutral. But the Germans invaded Belgium and overran Belgium in May of 1940. And like all able-bodied men in Belgium, he was conscripted into the army and ordered to try to get to France to join up with the French army and fight on the side of the Allies. And Paul and other men of his unit kept running into Germans and not being able to get across the lines. When they got to where they thought they maybe could meet up with the French army, nobody was there because they had retreated. And I think it was pretty frightening and pretty horrific. And eventually it became clear that there was no, there were some people that got to Dunkirk and got out, got to England to continue fighting, but Paul didn't, and I think it became clear he wasn't, and the people that he were with were not going to get through. And eventually they had to go back to Brussels, which was then occupied by the Germans and survived there. And it can't have been easy. There were shortages, there was a lot of tension and fear. He got a job that involved processing ration coupons or ration books for foreigners. Brussels was not saturation bombed like some cities, but it was not a calm or easy place to spend the war.
So during the Nazi occupation, there wasn't a lot for Paul to do except for work. So he kept himself busy by writing books and collaborating with respected Belgian expressionist artists. Alice Fry illustrated his book about the 7 days of creation that he wrote during that time.
In 1940, he had been a reporter for what translates as the National Telegraphic Association or Organization of Belgium, and it was essentially a kind of news agency. In the immediate years after the war, Paul returned first to the National Telegraphic Agency, again as a reporter. He actually did reporting on the last days of the war. He reported on the Battle of the Bulge, and then after the liberation of Belgium and of Brussels, there seemed to be sort of a real outpouring of creativity after the tensions and the deprivations of the war years.
In 1944, Paul joined the staff of the newspaper Le Phare as their art critic and travel reporter. His work was widely followed. He critiqued important art shows, such as one by Matisse. He interviewed modernist artists like James Ensor and Andrew Lote. So for a time, Paul also had a small gallery, a seaside resort town, where he showed his own work next to progressive artists.
Eventually, though, he decided that he was interested in getting out of Europe. And in those post-war years, it's the end of the hot war, but it's the beginning of the Cold War.
By the 1950s, that's post-World War II, Europe really had to regenerate itself. And so art was sort of the last thing it was really thinking about. It was more concerned about getting itself going economically.
For a time, he was an assistant to the consul general from Haiti in Brussels. And that was a very important connection for him to make, because he eventually ended up going back to Haiti through the invitation of the man that he had worked with.
Belgium after the war, it was just not a pleasant place to live. Belgian economy was in disarray. So many Belgians, including Paul, they were afraid that another war was coming. Life was really anxious there. In 1947, Paul accepted an invitation from a former colleague to visit Haiti. So he persuaded his newspaper to support his trip in exchange for a series of travel articles.
Erika was born in 1924 in Vienna, Austria, into what would be regarded as a very stable, middle-class family.
Well, they were a Jewish family living in Vienna. In the 1930s, they came to realize that life was going to become dangerous. Her father was a lawyer, her mother a doctor. She was an only child, and they finally decided they had to leave Austria.
It was a matter of considerable alarm for Erika's father, convinced as he was that the Nazis would be in Austria at some point. He said they took over in Germany, they're going to be here. So not long after that takeover in Germany, he set about trying to find a way out for the family of where to go. And it took, from that point, it took 6 years. They finally arrived in the United States in 1939 with a number of stops in between.
So Erika and her family were actually very lucky. Most of her immediate family was able to get out of Austria. And they first went to Switzerland, where Erika, who had been attending a Jewish preparatory school, attended a Swiss boarding school, while they were waiting to be able to come to the United States.
That if they were able to get to the United States, they were going to be fine. I mean, they knew a lot about the United States. They knew they would have they'd be safe, and they have an opportunity. They would be fine. Desperate, really desperate to get here.
So on her father's side, her aunt and her uncle, who was a physician, they committed suicide before others in their community were gassed in mobile gas chambers. On her mother's side, she lost an aunt and a cousin who were transported to a concentration camp. They didn't survive.
She didn't want to call herself a Holocaust survivor because she didn't think that was what she was, but as a refugee, I guess.
But she ended up in Queens, New York, which is considered to be perhaps the most diverse community in the country.
New York was full of all kinds of minorities, so she was in high school with black kids and Italian kids, and she was one among many minorities. She was 15 when she arrived, and she knew very little English, but as a young person, she was able to pick it up rather quickly. But I think Erica, like a lot of young people, wanted to mainstream as quickly as possible, and she was able to do that once her parents enrolled her in high school.
And she ended up going to Queens College for her bachelor's degree.
The most formative experience at Queens College was a course with Hortense Powdermaker. She had started life as a labor organizer as a young adult. The course that Erica took with Hortense Powdermaker really ignited her interest in anthropology because Powdermaker wanted everyone in the class, mostly first, second generation Americans or immigrants, to write a paper on a minority with one caveat: don't work on your own minority. And so Erica picked Italian. She said, I knew nothing about Italians. But from the literature, Erica was discovering that the kinds of things that she and her family were going through in terms of adjustment, in terms of understanding the differences between themselves and mainstream America, were not unique. These were the experiences of other immigrant minorities like Italians. And that was a very considerable breakthrough for her. She was very well placed as someone aspiring to be an anthropologist, because the thing to remember is there were many, many refugee scholars in New York during the war. One of the opportunities she took advantage of was to take a course at the New School for Social Research, where the great French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss was teaching. Also in New York, she had met a man who was very instrumental in her going to graduate school at Northwestern. His name was A.I. Hallowell.
At Northwestern, she studied under Hallowell briefly. She was a field researcher on a Chippewa Indian reservation in Wisconsin. Then after that, she began studying with Melville Herskovits. Herskovits thought getting a master's degree was a waste of time. Erica went directly from an undergraduate program to a PhD program.
And so she did her doctorate at Northwestern University. And Franz Boas had been the founder of American anthropology and established the first academic program in the field at Columbia University. And he trained Melville Herskovits, and then Herskovits trained Erica.
When Hallowell decided to return to Pennsylvania, so he returned there, and Erica stayed in Evanston and began working with Herskovits. And that's how she got to Haiti, because he had done research there and had published a book, Life in a Haitian Village, got a grant, and basically told her that she was going to do field work in Haiti, and that's how she developed her interests there.
Paul arrived in Haiti in May of 1947. Erica arrived in August of 1947. I believe that Erica and Paul met very shortly after she arrived in Haiti.
He met her at breakfast. They both spoke French. He was to leave. He did not leave. He stayed. She stayed and did this field work. She was 23 when they met. And I just think it's a fabulous love story.
He had already been there for some months, and so I think he kind of became one of her sort of guides to getting around and to seeing different places. And I think that was also part of what brought Paul and Erica together, is that they were both, in a sense, strangers in a strange land. In terms of trying to imagine what his purpose was, I think it was to find a new life, to try something different, to be somewhere else. And he got the newspaper Le Phare to sort of sponsor him as a foreign correspondent. And he did some reporting on Haiti and on the region. He was by this time taking photographs. And I think that she realized that his photographs could be very useful to her research, or maybe they both just wanted some sort of an excuse to travel together, to look at things together.
So Paul didn't paint during this period in Haiti. He considered himself a writer and a photographer. He took a lot of photographs. Erica published quite a few of them in her books over the years. Then she archived them in the Ohio State University's Knowledge Bank.
I think he was interested in photography, but I don't know that he thought his photography was art. I think he thought it was photography. I know that Paul had a pretty wide circle of acquaintances that included poets and politicians and painters and artists. Some of those acquaintances became the basis of a novel that he wrote called The Greener Grass, and became also the basis for some of the images that he painted of cafe scenes.
There was a lot of expatriates, Truman Capote, Andre Breton, Ernest Hemingway, many other artists, writers. The Haitian Primitif movement was just blossoming.
She gets a big kick out of telling about meeting Truman Capote, and he was staying in that same little hotel, and how he would walk around town with a necktie as a belt. You know, and how eccentric he was.
Erica worked not only in Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, but she worked in two smaller communities that really weren't that far out of the city. One of them was an area where sugar was grown that was to the west of Port-au-Prince, and the other was an area in a village called Furcy that was up in the mountains that was southeast of Port-au-Prince.
Erica did a lot of work in Haiti. She conducted interviews with Haitians, including with school children. She collected their drawings of what was important to them.
One of the things Haiti's known for, of course, is voodoo.
You can't be in Haiti very long without learning about what is popularly called voodoo, but of course the real way it's said is vaudun, and spirit possession and trance. And she began getting interested in those things, and that set the trajectory for her career.
As far as I know, she's one of the first people to study possession trance in Haiti and link it to the African origins of the Haitian population, who were slaves to begin with. Voodoo priests helped to lead the slave rebellion in Haiti, which was the only successful rebellion against slavery in the whole new world. And instead of trying to scare people with what it represented, she showed its historical origins and its value in that society. I mean, she did this study in Haiti in great detail, but then she related it to other cultures by using data collected by other anthropologists and making comparisons between groups, finding the similarities and the differences.
Her work in Haiti, one of the key things that really that was about was that sparked her interest in possession and trance states, two things that are not unusual within religions. And so she ended up going from that study in Haiti to focusing on those two topics. Sometimes you get just trance states, sometimes you get just possession states, and sometimes you get both.
So the different kinds of roles that the voodoo priests and priestesses played in the culture, and also observing and finding out about how sort of trance states worked. And that became a basis that her research went on from for decades.
Which sounds kind of, to most Americans, pretty bizarre. But in fact, worldwide, spirit possession is part of normal behavior. It's part of the cultural setting. And so individuals who are possessed by spirits, that's part of the culture.
While Erica was finishing up her fieldwork in Haiti, Paul traveled to Peru. And that was in August of 1948. He stayed 15 months in Peru. Given the state of Europe after the war, it seemed to be a good choice for him. He was tired of Haiti. He traveled around, he took photographs, he wrote a book there that was illustrated by Cristina Galvez, who was a great artist there in Peru. And he also, of course, he corresponded with Erica.
Erica left in the summer of 1948 to go back to Northwestern and return to her graduate studies. And then in 1949, she was offered what was originally supposed to be a temporary position teaching at Ohio State.
Erica came to teach a class for 1 quarter at Ohio State and ended up staying 41 years.
So this is 1949, at a time when there were just a handful of anthropologists. And so she's one of the founding members, really, of this department.
So she was 25 and had all kinds of students that were going to college on the GI Bill who were, older than she was. She talked about how she needed to be, pretty tough and pretty firm to be respected as a teacher.
Many of Erica's students were men back from the war on the GI Bill. And they were older than she, and she was tiny. So she had to inspire them to listen to her, with respect and to learn. It must have been enormously challenging.
She was hired as an instructor, and being hired as an instructor means that it's not a permanent job. But then she was promoted to assistant professor, which is a tenure track position. She got tenure and progressed through the ranks to associate professor with tenure and then ultimately full professor.
And also the only woman to ever be the chairman of our department.
She was the chair for, not a real long time, and then she went back to teaching. But when she started, it was a combined department that was sociology and anthropology, and it wasn't until later that there really was an anthropology department, and she was, one of its sort of founding members.
Yes, she would be considered to be a cultural anthropologist, and her specializations within that field would be psychological anthropology and the anthropology of religion. And then she developed this specialization that would have to do with women.
As an anthropologist, she studied the psychological makeup of people in different cultures, looking for similarities among people all over the world and for differences among people all over the world. For example, one of the things she taught me that sticks with me forever, she was interested in people with split personalities. It's a psychological phenomenon. She and I even visited a mental hospital in Columbus that housed a person who was famous for his split personality. And we looked at videotapes of his behavior. And she said to me, in this country, split personality is considered a pathological condition. And we have to send the person to the hospital and try to get him to reunite his personalities into one. But she said, if you were living in Haiti or in Brazil, a person with a split personality is regarded as someone very special, as somebody who has a gift, not a pathological condition.
But her whole life was anthropology. She was always doing anthropology. We would talk about all these topics all the time and just have these wonderful conversations and current events and just everything that was going on. And you'd talk about family, and then she'd start giving you information about all these people she had encountered and the complexities of their families. And she was always gathering data, that type of thing. So it was always a joy, that she had something to bring to every conversation.
She was a very good storyteller and very good at relating her own past, her own experience.
So when you have a conversation with her, it's it's not sort of superficial. It's a discussion, and what's ever on her mind, what's going on politically around in Columbus or around the country.
When she talked to you, you were the only person in the room. She had that skill of making you have all of her attention when she was talking to you or with you.
And she gave a lot to students, especially to graduate students. She was an amazing advisor to a lot of people.
She would be able to engage with students wherever they were. So people would ask questions from all over the map, and she would somehow manage to bring it into, somehow manage to make sense of it.
She was very challenging in her seminars. She would ask you questions you didn't want her to ask because you really needed to you need to study everything before that class.
I guess she also had this expectations of students that they would stand for what they came believing or in their interpretation. She also expected them, as I did too, to grow in their thinking over the quarter, not just what they brought to the class.
You know, I certainly wouldn't be who I am, for better or worse, without Erica.
She was very interested in everybody's lives. She really liked knowing what we all did and how we got to her class.
Erica actually was very instrumental and very involved. She was part of a committee called the Committee on Academic Excellence for Women. She was one of the founders of that initiative that really tried to work with the dynamics of women getting through degrees, because they often would be older, they often would have children, and so she was trying to work with some of those issues to facilitate women being more successful.
When I was working for her as a graduate assistant, she once got a postcard requesting a reprint of an article she'd written from a shaman in Siberia. I was really floored. I said, Erica, look, a shaman is asking for your input. She just shrugged her shoulders, says, oh yeah, that's normal. You know, to me that was something really amazing.
Erica left an important legacy in terms of methodology. She did field work, but she only did field work in Haiti early in her career. However, from that point, she did a major comparative study, which was a big contribution to methodology, where she used computerized programs to analyze a large body of data to look at this issue of possession and trance. Then from there too, you have the women, the fact that she really established a specialization in women.
She often said that her life story, her life history, and her becoming an anthropologist were kind of a seamless unit, because anthropologists are continuously looking at the differences, the cultural differences around them, and trying to assimilate them and trying to understand them. And that's what she was doing as an immigrant before she'd ever heard of anthropology.
You know, those early experiences, I think, had a huge effect on her. And then, of course, being trained and doing the field work, but her whole life was anthropology.
As long as people are working on spirit possession, religion, psychological anthropology, she will be a touchstone. She will be a resource of great importance as a scholar for people who would never have had the privilege of knowing her. But it's her work, her wonderful record of publication that endures.
He started taking art lessons while he was a teenager. I think studied with actually some pretty significant Belgian academic artists.
He never went to formal art school. He did not attend, you know, an art academy or anything like that. And one of the things that was unique about his style that these artists observed and his teachers observed was he often represented things in ways that were different than they appeared in reality.
So here he had painted a picture of this house and he had painted it yellow, and he thought it was one of the best things he'd ever done. And his teacher was outraged because the house was white, and how could he have not painted the house in his picture white.
And so his use of color and the way he conveyed scenes and images was really different than what was happening in the art world at that time.
I think first break with total representational realism of what he sees, and changing instead to truth, to what he thought seemed right.
I think that's something that was unique, and it's something that was a technique that he stuck with his whole life, and he really was not bound by or constrained by the conventions of how painters were supposed to paint.
He was very aware of what was happening in Europe in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s, and he sort of picked up then in the 50s and was trying it out, trying each one of those different styles on for size to see what fit him, to see what he liked.
The thing that impresses me the most, it starts out, the very earliest pieces are very Matisse-like. He did a lot of figurative things, and they're all nice. He did a lot of landscapes, and they're well done. He has a broad variety of work, but you can always tell who did it.
He was able to sort of leave one idea and move into another idea, not get stuck somewhere as a painter. So yeah, I admire the whole idea of moving forward and then being able to break away and try these different things, not being stuck in a place. That guy was not stuck, for sure. His work demonstrates how much he just wanted to keep moving forward as a painter.
His early work was in pastel. So he decided there weren't enough colors in the box, and when he got to Columbus, Ohio, he threw them away. He then painted in gouache, which is kind of an opaque watercolor. He briefly tried oil painting in Peru, but it took 3 days to dry. So in the 70s, he switched to acrylic.
I would say that you really see certain hallmarks, which is a love of color and a love of flatness, which comes out, I think, again, from Matisse. It's a very sort of Matissean quality. His love of outline, of a strong outline, which kind of is a reminiscent of stained glass windows. And then very late in his work, you see this interest in abstraction. Paper surface of the picture surface, completely covered with dabs and brushes and squiggles of paint, which he then somehow teases out a suggestion of a figure.
It's what you don't put down, right? It's sort of where you finish, what you leave, and he had that too. You know, he'd leave a lot of ground, he'd leave a lot of space.
And everything he did has that, it's just enough. I don't think he ever overworked anything.
He was pushing many different boundaries, and he worked in many different media. There was everything from graphite drawings to paintings, large scale, small scale. They were just very compelling. He was capturing the essence of humanity.
His work mines all kinds of different versions of modernist art. Art that sort of straddles that line between being recognizable and not being recognizable.
These head drawings, these head paintings he did that were these sort of geometric shapes of human heads, which isn't even close to reality.
Every time we look at the painting, we see something a little different that we hadn't seen before, a little speck of color here, a little squiggle over here.
I think people respond to the human, the very human quality of Paul's work, whether it's something joyous happening or whether it's something pensive, something that sort of takes you into another realm, an area of thoughtfulness. I think there's an accessibility about Paul's work that's very appealing to many people. At the same time, it feels modern.
I think his style is very, very, very informed by European modernism, far more than by American modernism.
Paul really doesn't come to pure abstraction until the very end of his life in the 1980s. And it's a really interesting phenomenon, though, that even in Paul's most abstract works, there is still usually the title or something that he picks out in the work of art that connects it to the human story, the human drama, a mother and child, a person, a religious figure.
You know, when you look at them, there's not a lot going on in the eyes. Sometimes you have to read into it something about the people, and I like that. Some of them are just mysteries, but that makes you dig into the piece a little more visually.
They're interesting to look at. They engage you without assaulting you or without making you feel too uncomfortable. And, you know, that's something I think that appeals to many people.
The paintings just make you feel good. I mean, they cause me to stop and want to reflect on Paul and his journey and his experience and through his travels and the people that he met and the things that he saw. I guess I have an appreciation for how he chose to depict that on paper and on canvas.
I know the difficulty in making good renderings and what goes into it and how much thought goes into it and how much measuring goes into it. If I'm drawing your face, I need to lay down points on my paper to sort of get an idea of that. But for somebody to put a pencil down and slide it around and pull that off, it's pretty extraordinary.
And I really love his abstracts. When he goes so far abstract that he really got into this almost fractal or geometric little tiny marks. His way of applying the paint was very different in those. The greater degree of abstraction appeared as he matured as an artist, as he got older.
After he came to the United States, after he married Erica, I think his world started getting smaller and smaller. His paintings reflect that, because he became more and more abstract in his art. And I believe he developed this huge inner world of a vast imagination of colors and forms and ideas that filled that need that he had. You know, he did paint some scenes from memory from his years in Haiti and Peru and other places. I believe that his real development occurred when he was all alone and his whole world was in his mind.
Not by just reading about other places, although he did that, but by painting his memories of all the different places he went. In Europe, in the former Yugoslavia, in North Africa, in Spain, in Italy, in France, and also very much in Haiti and in Peru. I think he just was living in his head by reimagining all these places that he knew and loved.
When you see his work, because he's so good, you know where it is. You know it's Eastern Europe, you know it's Paris, you can see the bridges, you can see the towers. And the Haitian paintings that he did, you know, they're much more scattered, they're really more light-filled, and I guess you get a sense of the different places. But I don't think that he painted them any differently. I think he observed, and in Haiti, what he observed were trees silhouetted against the sky, cast shadows that were awkward colors, yellows or purples, maybe that don't look natural. That's what he saw, that's what he painted.
It doesn't surprise me that although he was not a particularly devout person, that references to Christian subjects continue to be part of his work throughout his life.
But I think his religion sort of expressed a larger embracing of humanity, and I think he saw that in the art of Rouault.
In the 1960s, he drew 250 illustrations or so of the Old Testament. And in the 70s, he drew a series of the Way of the Cross, or what he called the Via Crucis. So this is the first time that I knew that Paul was a genius. Jesus was clearly Jewish, and he was clearly suffering. When Jesus carried the cross, it was awkward and not pretty. He fell 3 times. Each time he lost more pencil lines, and he fell lower on the page with each fall, until he was just a smears on the bottom of the page. A church purchased those drawings, and they are now incorporated in worship as the Stations of the Cross.
They're all along the wall, going up to the sanctuary, going up to the altar. They're very simple.
He wasn't really painting for the art market in Columbus. He didn't really have to. He didn't need to sell his art to succeed. He was painting for his own enrichment because he needed to paint, because Erica allowed him to paint. And that's the wonderful part of Paul's story.
He started exhibiting in Ohio in the 1960s. So he exhibited in Columbus, in Iowa, in Canada. But most notably, this is the big deal, he had a big solo show at what was then the Columbus Gallery of Fine Arts, and that was in 1964.
But I don't think he promoted his work very much. And it wasn't until after he passed away that Erica went to great efforts to do that, and she was very successful with that. The same thing with his novel, The Greener Grass. He never published it, she did.
After Paul's death in 1988, Erica continued to promote his work. Gallery 5 was the big step. Lynn Muskoff was a fantastic advocate. His work started to become known and collected in Columbus.
Lynn Muskoff, she was the pioneer in trying to promote a Bourguignon.
We were very impressed with the art, and very impressed with his whole the history that we were able to get at that point in time. Really, other than Rene Steidl, we were the first ones to really give his art exposure in Columbus. And we really sort of brought him to light, I think, among the art collecting population.
Lynn had advertised in a art magazine for the first time, very expensive ad. I subscribed to that magazine, and I opened it up and saw this, and immediately went down the next day because I wanted to buy it. I didn't want it to get away from me, and she wasn't open. So I went across the street and had a cup of coffee and watched her shop until somebody finally came and opened the door, and I rushed over and said, I want to buy that.
I mean, he was just, I've got to have that painting.
And I didn't want anybody else to have it. I didn't want to share it with anybody.
He was one of the most prolific painters that I have ever encountered. And his range of style and his range of skill were both expansive.
Erica arranged a major retrospective at the Schumacher Gallery shortly after Paul's death. There was another one at the Richard M. Ross Museum of Art in Delaware. This is the best one, though. She exhibited Paul's work in New York in 2006. After Gallery 5 closed, then, Erica began exhibiting Paul's work at Art Access Gallery in Columbus. Soon after, Alt Gallery in Sedona, Arizona was interested in showing Paul's work. And then Ventana Fine Art in Santa Fe. That first week that he was at Ventana, 26 pieces sold immediately, just like that.
We have a very international crowd here. A lot of people from all over the world come to Santa Fe, and they have responded very positively to his work in our Ventana Gallery.
His art was shown in Cleveland, Toledo, Akron, and Cincinnati. Within 20 years of his death, his work had been exhibited in 50 shows. Quite a few museums, including a museum in Brussels, began acquiring Bourguignon work for their permanent collections.
He probably said early on, you know, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, you know, I take photographs, but I really want to paint. And that must have, you know, there's a romance about a painter.
I think that their lives really are an example of the possibilities that can happen when we step outside those stereotypical relationships. It allowed Erica to pursue a fabulous career as a faculty member over the span of 4 decades, and it also freed up Paul to create a massive body of work that is a real treasure for us to this day.
I think Erica derived great satisfaction from her teaching, from her career. I mean, intellectually, you know, she's brilliant, and she made wonderful use of those talents. But when she went home, Paul was her life, and Paul and she then shared their love of art.
You know, that somehow this always seemed like it was a romantic relationship, that there was a lot of love. You know, she obviously had a lot of love for him. They didn't really entertain a lot, they didn't go out a lot. You know, most of their life was within that house.
So I sort of think of it as this house where, you know, you walked in the front door and suddenly you were somewhere in Europe, you know, maybe in Belgium or France.
They talked French to each other. They held on to some degree of Europeanness with each other that they really couldn't have pretty much anywhere else. They shared a love of music.
He was very into music, yes, and Eric and my husband talked a lot about that because my husband collected records, and Paul and Erica had a very, very large collection of records.
Paul would collect things and do his paintings, and she would come home and they would have wine or sherry or tea. I think their home life was really kind of a refuge for both of them.
We would all go into the living room, and Paul would sit on the sofa, and I would sit on the sofa at the other end, and we would talk to each other, and Erica would sit in a chair opposite us.
He would come down frequently and have tea with us or something like that, but then it wasn't until I started talking to him about his art that he would be more involved with us.
He liked to tease by showing me his painting and saying, "What do you see here?" Well, there's little circles and there's little dots, and oh yeah, there's a profile there of somebody, you know. And he would just smile and grin and not say a word, and she wouldn't either. So it was just really fun.
It was wonderful. He had a very wry sense of humor. The best memories I have of Erica and Paul together is because I would see Erica at class and at school, and she was very professional. And then I would see Erica and Paul together, and he could make her giggle so easily. He would just say little things, and she'd giggle, and it's like, what? Professor Bourguignon's giggling?
Well, I had the same impression every time I walked into that house, not just the first time. It's overwhelming. It was like a museum. There were sculptures and tapestries and paintings and objects all over the place, everywhere you looked. So you could sit there in one chair and look around the room for hours and see things that you'd never seen before. To me, it was like Paul bringing the world into his house. Paul and Erica probably too, but Paul mainly, I think, because I think he was responsible for most of the things that were there. He brought the world inside the house.
You know, it's all, as I say, the house was just one big sort of blur of images. I think she loved visual things. It's clear from her house. She loved all kinds of things, not just Paul's paintings, but objects and books and bindings of, you know, and the record covers.
And it was just filled with Paul's work. It was always this presence. He was always there.
Walking into Paul's studio was like a time capsule. And you could almost imagine him sitting there. It was the most wonderful experience.
I remember her showing us the north bedroom where he painted, and after he died, she never touched anything. It was exactly the way he had left it, brushes, canvas, everything.
They clearly had just this great life together. It was just an amazing house. In some respects, it was a house where the clocks stopped in 1988 at Paul's death. But in other ways, it was a house that continued to grow. You know, Erica was constantly, I think, thinking about having conversations with Paul, looking at his work, not letting things stagnate and become dusty. I mean, she was constantly thinking about what can I do to introduce Paul, to keep Paul's life and art vital, you know, today.
So Erica, early on, when she realized what a big project this was, got a lot of help. That's why I would stop and see her quite often, because she wanted to talk about what she could do to get Paul's work out there. She didn't want it to sit in her basement and then have something happen to her, and then what are we going to do with it? She really wanted people to have it and to love it and take care of it, and then she didn't have to worry about it.
I mean, she was on a mission to make this work known.
She planned several exhibitions every year across the United States. A high point was exactly 50 years after Paul's first solo exhibition at what was then the Columbus Gallery of Fine Arts. Erica began working toward a second show at the Columbus Museum of Art.
I believe Erica really saw this as a chance to do something really important for Paul, which was something she had always wanted, and that was another retrospective at the Columbus Museum of Art. People have said, and I felt this myself, it was Erica's reason for living. It kept her going, and it was a source of tremendous joy and satisfaction to her.
I can't even tell you how much that meant to her, because through her it meant Paul, you know, that was something she was doing for Paul. And I think it was one of the things that really helped her live the length of time that she did. And she always talked about the fact that you have to do things that get you out of yourself, and that was what made life meaningful and gave you energy. And so taking up Paul's career after he had died and she was retiring was really an essential part of her life.
In many of the meetings with Erica, she wanted me to get to know Paul's work increasingly. So there were always new works that she showed me, and it's very recognizable, it's solid, it's high quality, it's well loved in the community.
Following the museum show, the Columbus Museum of Art show exhibition, I think people were thrilled. They were thrilled for Erica, they were thrilled about the work, they were delighted the museum participated. It was just gratefulness on all sides, and what a tribute.
All of our students were there from 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It didn't matter. Everybody wanted to celebrate Erica.
And it gave a nice continuum for their life, from the time they met in Haiti all the way to Columbus, Ohio.
The legacy is what you go and see and are able to observe. They left something behind that you can still appreciate, and the tangible thing is the art that's hanging on the walls in the galleries and people's homes and in museums.
I see his work as timeless, and again, because it's so figural, it's about humans being with other humans, and it's about showing us where he lived, what he loved, he has shared with us. So I find it to be timeless.
When I talk to people about this exhibition, I talk to them about the diversity in the work. There's different genres and different styles of work here that really tell Paul's story.
So when I first started representing that body of work in about 2000, he already had a following of people. Just because there's so many people now that know about him, they want a piece of somebody, maybe because he's local. She'd be so excited to know that how much of the work is sold and how much of it really is out in the public.
Paul's body of work provided us a really unique opportunity because it was a window on both Erica's work as an anthropologist and also his work as a fine artist.
I think in a way, Erica and Paul were similar with their life's work. As an anthropologist, Erica did not judge or sugarcoat her subjects. And Paul didn't sugarcoat or idealize his painting subjects either.
He's different. He's just unusual. He's unique. He's one of a kind. And I think that's the thing, and I look for that.
I see happiness in his paintings. I mean, I think that's a word that's been used to describe his work quite often.
Looking at his work and just seeing the light and the energy and feeling that, this was something that we wanted to have in our house. Every time we look at it for the first time. That's what art does for me is, every time you look at something, you see something new, or it evokes a different kind of emotion, or you get a different perspective, and that was kind of the Bourguignon moment for us.
There are over 100 galleries here on Canyon Road. There's probably over 200 galleries in Santa Fe itself.
This is the second largest art market in the United States, behind New York City.
I consider him one of the great masters of 20th century modernist theory and practice.
It fits. It fits. We got a room full of people in there, looking at it for the third time.
This is a wonderful story of a man who was very worldly, but did indeed live here in Columbus, Ohio.
And I think that Paul's work will be looked at 50 years now. I'm sure it will.
Paul's legacy is his artwork. He's represented by multiple galleries. He's in collections and museums throughout the United States and in Europe. And Erica's legacy is that she is a world-renowned anthropologist, a stellar teacher and scholar. She was a mentor to so many people, and what they accomplished is going to live forever.
So she has a legacy of these former students all over the U.S. So there is quite a crowd that has followed her.
At the end of her life, Erica set up a charitable trust with the Columbus Foundation, so that all the proceeds from Paul's artwork will further the visual arts in Ohio.
Erica and Paul's lives are examples of what becomes available to us when we are open to the possibility of different roles, when we are open to the possibility of exploring cultural heritages that are different from our own, and also when we open up our minds to immigrants, because both Paul and Erica were in fact immigrants to this country, and their European heritage really enriched their lives, and when we allow ourselves to tap into that, our lives are enriched as well.